A black waiter gave two hungry children a hot meal and lost everything. For 3 silent years, he gathered evidence and brought down an empire that tried to erase him. Then 20 years later, as the city stirred or drifted to sleep, a helicopter touched down in front of his modest home. Who was inside and why now? If you're watching this right now, wherever you are in the world, we're grateful you're here. Stay with us because what unfolds next will challenge everything you thought you knew about justice, memory, and quiet, unstoppable strength. The stillness of the early morning in that quiet suburban neighborhood was not just typical, it was sacred. Yards were neatly trimmed porch lights still glowing faintly against the lingering mist, and birds had just begun their tentative morning calls. It was a neighborhood that prized silence, order, and the comfort of routine. That's why the sudden roar of helicopter blades slicing through the dawn air landed like a hammer blow. The sound wasn't just loud, it was deliberate, a steady mechanical thrumming that grew louder with every passing second, drawing curtains apart and raising eyebrows across the street. It wasn't the kind of noise anyone expected in a place where the biggest excitement was a misdelivered newspaper or a barking dog. Inside one modest house with a well-kept lawn and white-painted fence, Timothy Christopher stood at the kitchen sink, his hands submerged in warm, soapy dishwater. The soft clink of porcelain under his fingers was suddenly drowned out by the low-pitched growl of the descending aircraft. His posture didn't change. He didn't flinch, didn't turn his head. Instead, he stood still, breathing slowly, as if waiting for the world to catch up with something he already knew was coming. Outside the helicopter, a sleek black machine built more like a military chopper than a corporate vehicle descended with the kind of slow, practiced elegance that only came with precision and authority. It didn't just land, it arrived. As its skids touched down squarely in front of Timothy's gate, the wind from the blades pushed against the hedges, sent mailboxes rattling, and stirred a wave of curiosity throughout the neighborhood. Windows opened, cameras clicked, lawns were left half-mowed as neighbors stepped out barefoot, in robes and slippers shielding their eyes from the flying dust. 2 figures emerged from the helicopter. The man was tall in a sharply cut navy suit, his tie held in place by a silver bar that caught the morning sun. Beside him was a woman in a cream-colored coat, her presence poised and confident, her hair neatly tied back. They didn't speak. They didn't glance around. They moved with intention down the stone walkway and toward Timothy's front door. Inside, Timothy calmly reached for a towel. His movements were slow, practiced, almost ceremonial. He dried his hands one by one, folded the towel in half, and placed it neatly on the counter. Then he exhaled, not with anxiety, but with a profound sense of resolution. The moment had come, not suddenly, but inevitably, and somewhere deep inside it felt less like an interruption and more like a promise, finally kept. 20 years earlier, Timothy had stood in a very different space, one not of dignity, but of survival. He was 25, a young black man working as a waiter at the Gilded Spoon, a high-end restaurant nestled in the city's affluent district. The kind of place with soft jazz playing in the background where napkins were folded like origami, and customers rarely made eye contact with the people serving them. Back then, he worked 2 jobs. He scrubbed floors in the early hours of the morning, his knees sore from endless mopping, then rushed across town to spend his afternoons and evenings balancing trays and smiling politely to patrons who called him boy without shame. It wasn't prideful work, but it was honest, and it was necessary. His mother Caroline was battling late-stage diabetes, and medical bills had piled up like a second mortgage. He'd mastered the rhythm of quiet endurance, navigating a world that expected him to remain invisible, agreeable, and compliant. He knew how to disappear in a room full of power suits and pearl necklaces, until that one December night. It was bone cold outside, the kind of night when even the air feels sharp against your skin. Timothy was on his break out back near the dumpster behind the restaurant, catching his breath in the biting wind. That's when he saw them, 2 children, standing close together, shivering visibly under worn jackets. A boy and a girl. The boy looked around 10, the girl perhaps 8. Their skin was pale, flushed red from the cold. Their eyes darted nervously, but they didn't speak. The girl held the boy's hand tightly, her knuckles white. Timothy's first reaction was instinctual. He pulled off his own jacket and wrapped it around their shoulders. He asked no questions, didn't demand an explanation. He brought them inside, sneaking them through the kitchen entrance, and found a quiet corner near the storage room. He gave them warm food scraps that would have been thrown away otherwise, and watched as they ate slowly, mechanically, like children who had forgotten what it meant to feel full. Their names, he would later learn, were Baron and Zoe. They had lost their parents in a car crash, and with no extended family willing to take them in, they had slipped through the cracks of the foster care system. They were white, their faces still bearing the softness of children who hadn't yet grown cynical, but their eyes, those told a different story. Fear, mistrust, hunger, the kind that burrows deep. Timothy didn't think twice. From that night on, he fed them, quietly, discreetly. After each shift, he saved what he could, sometimes sneaking extra portions from the kitchen. He didn't tell anyone, not because he was ashamed, but because he knew what the consequences might be. He was right. 3 weeks later, the restaurant manager found out. Stephen Garrick was a man in his early 50s, white, silver-haired, always in a starched shirt, and always carrying himself like he owned every room he walked into. His sense of superiority wasn't loud. It was woven into every word, every sideways glance, every reminder that Timothy should be grateful. When Stephen confronted him, it wasn't in private. It was in the middle of the kitchen in front of every dishwasher, busboy, and server. "Do you think this is a soup kitchen?" He barked, his voice hard and cutting. Timothy stood still, his shoulders relaxed, his eyes calm. He didn't defend himself. He didn't speak. "You clueless black man," Stephen continued louder this time. "You should be thanking me for the job I gave you, not giving food away to street rats." The room went silent. Some workers looked down at their shoes. Others glanced nervously toward the exit. No one intervened. No one stood up. Timothy simply removed his apron, folded it, and placed it on the counter. He walked out without a word, his dignity intact, but his income gone. The children were waiting that night, as always, in the alley nearby. He didn't tell them what had happened. Instead, he brought them home. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom apartment shared with his mother, but it was warm and it was safe. He split what little food he had and made sure Baron and Zoe had a blanket and a mattress to sleep on. For weeks, he kept doing the same. No job barely enough to eat, but always something saved for the children. And then, just like that, they were gone. Social services came while he was out looking for odd jobs. A neighbor said the officers had appeared with clipboards and quiet voices, and the children had followed without resistance. He tried to find out where they'd been taken, called every office he could, but the system offered no answers to someone with no legal ties and no voice in the bureaucracy. That silence, different from the one on the morning of the helicopter, was heavy. It was the silence of powerlessness, of kindness punished, of a man who had done the right thing and paid the price alone. That winter was long. The city didn't care, and for a time neither did anyone else. But Timothy never forgot. Not the children, not the insult, not the eyes of the man who fired him, not the look of fear on Zoe's face or the gratitude in Baron's. He remembered everything. And now, 2 decades later, as 2 dignified strangers approached his door from a black helicopter that had just stunned an entire neighborhood into silence, Timothy Christopher knew in his bones without a shred of doubt that the past was not over. It had just arrived. The public humiliation Timothy endured at the Gilded Spoon was not the end of it. It wasn't meant to be. In truth, it was only the beginning, the opening move in a quieter, far more malicious campaign. Stephen Garrick, the man who had fired him in front of a full kitchen, had no intention of simply letting the matter go. For Garrick, the incident wasn't about a policy violation or a simple firing. It was about sending a message, and he made sure that message echoed far beyond the walls of his restaurant. Stephen picked up the phone repeatedly, each call placed with the casual ease of a man who believed in his own authority, was made to friends, business partners, other restaurant owners. The conversations were subtle, polite, even cloaked in the language of concern. But the meaning was unmistakable. "I'm just warning you," he would say, leaning back in his chair at the private club, his voice low but steady. "This young man, Timothy Christopher, yes, the one I hired, he's trouble. Caught him stealing food. Said it was for kids on the street, if you can believe that. Classic story. Give them an inch." He would pause here, swirl the scotch in his glass, let his companions nod knowingly, before delivering the conclusion like a well-rehearsed sermon. "They'll take a mile. I thought I was doing charity hiring a black guy. But they always show their true colors, don't they?" The other men, mostly white, mostly older, would murmur in agreement. Some smiled tightly, others said nothing at all. But none of them questioned the narrative, and so the whispers spread like smoke through the city's dining scene. A nod from Stephen was enough to close doors Timothy didn't even know had been opened. He was blacklisted quietly, but thoroughly. He wasn't given formal rejections, he was simply never called back. Interviews were canceled, applications went missing, polite smiles hid sharp dismissals. Meanwhile, Timothy kept moving. With no job and no income, he scoured the city for anything that paid. In the mornings, still dark air thick with dew and city grit, he walked the streets with flyers under one arm, slipping them through mailboxes, taping them to light poles. In the afternoons, he scrubbed rims at the back of car washes, his hands raw from the chemicals. At night, he cleaned small offices alone, while the rest of the city slept. There was no rhythm to his days now, just motion, just survival. He rarely spoke. There wasn't much to say. When he returned home each night, his clothes carried the odor of bleach and engine oil. His shoulders slumped a little more than the night before. And every night, without fail, his mother, Mrs. Caroline, would be waiting, sitting in her worn armchair, a cup of tea cooling beside her. She watched him with eyes that had seen too much disappointment in the world, but still managed to hold love without judgment. Sometimes she'd say nothing at all. Other nights, she would gently take his hand, pull him to sit at her side, and tend to the small cuts and bruises on his palms. "My son," she would whisper, her voice soft, laced with exhaustion and love. "They don't see you. Not yet. But you have more in you than this town will ever admit." And she was right. What Stephen and his circle of influence never understood, what they didn't care enough to investigate, was that Timothy Christopher held a degree in business administration. He hadn't scraped by. He had graduated with top marks from a respected state university. His professors had once described him as methodical visionary and disciplined beyond his years. But when his mother's health had begun to deteriorate, he'd made a choice. Flexible work over prestigious titles, serving tables over conference rooms. He hadn't taken the job at the Gilded Spoon because it was all he could do. He'd taken it because it allowed him to care for the woman who had sacrificed everything for him. That diploma had sat tucked in the back of a drawer for years, pressed between a manila folder of bills and a notebook of dreams he'd stopped reading. The world had been content to view him as another unskilled worker, just another face in a crowd, and for a time he had let them. He had swallowed that version of himself in silence. Until the children appeared. Baron and Zoe had arrived during one of his shifts, cold and quiet, the kind of quiet that only children who have learned to distrust adults carry in their eyes. Their clothes were thin. Their skin pale and blotchy from the December air bore marks of neglect. Their hair was matted, their hands clenched tight with hunger and uncertainty. They were white, a boy and a girl, lost and invisible in a city that had no room for orphans unless they caused problems. Timothy had never asked them for details. He didn't need to. He saw enough in the way Baron kept himself between his sister and any adult who came too close, in how Zoe flinched at sudden movement, in how they ate cautiously, mechanically, as if preparing to be punished. And so, even after his firing, even after Stephen Garrick had tried to destroy his name, Timothy kept feeding them. He no longer had access to restaurant leftovers, but he gave what he had. When groceries were too expensive, he sold his watch. When the heating bill threatened to take priority, he wore extra layers and kept the apartment cold. He took on extra jobs, some humiliating, some degrading, just to buy canned soup and bread. He pawned an old stereo system he'd received as a graduation gift, then a coat, then a pair of shoes. All so 2 children he didn't owe anything to could go to bed with something in their stomachs. It wasn't about charity. It was about something else, something deeper. Maybe it was because he had once seen his own mother make similar choices for him. Maybe it was because when the world strips a person of dignity, the only way to keep breathing is to create it elsewhere. For Timothy Barron and Zoe had become his reason to keep moving. Their survival mattered to him. It gave shape to his days, a task, a responsibility, a promise he'd made to himself. No one knew about it. No one saw it, but it became the quiet center of his life. And that perhaps was what made it so unbearable when they disappeared. It was a bitter night, the kind where the cold didn't just cling to your coat, it pressed through it, seeping into the skin beneath. The city was winding down, but not asleep. Streetlights cast long, yellow beams across empty sidewalks. The wind was sharp, sending wrappers tumbling and rattling against the curbs. Timothy walked steadily, his breath rising in soft clouds. Slung over one shoulder was a plastic bag filled with leftovers from a wedding reception he had just finished cleaning up. The food was warm when he packed it, small portions of pasta, overcooked chicken bread rolls gone stale on the serving tray. But to him, and to the children waiting behind the alley near his building, it was a feast. He turned onto a quieter street, one lined with stately oaks and trimmed hedges leading toward a private club whose exterior spoke of old money-high archways, engraved plaques, stone steps polished by decades of expensive shoes. The porch light was on. Laughter echoed from within. That kind of laughter, boisterous, careless, told Timothy everything he needed to know before he even saw the faces. He slowed his pace. There on the patio stood Stephen Garrick Bourbon in hand shoulders, relaxed, surrounded by 3 or 4 other men dressed in dinner jackets. They stood in a semicircle, drinks in hand, the kind of posture men adopted when they felt untouchable. "Did you see that?" Stephen said, suddenly loud enough for Timothy to hear from across the street. He raised his glass and pointed directly at him. "The thief waiter is still out there picking up scraps like a stray dog." The others laughed, one of them nearly spilling his drink. Stephen chuckled deeper, his voice tightening with cruelty. "I bet he's selling the food. Probably to buy drugs. Always the same story with these types." Timothy stopped mid-step. The bag on his shoulder shifted slightly. A small roll of foil inside crinkled with the movement. He didn't speak. He didn't shout. But the heat that rose in his chest, tight and furious, nearly burned through his ribs. He stood still, under the street lamp, hands clenched beneath the plastic handle of the bag, his jaw set tight. For a moment, he pictured himself crossing the street, marching up those pristine marble steps, and facing every single one of them. He imagined pulling his degree from his coat pocket, the one he kept folded neatly in a plastic sleeve, and slapping it down on the table between their whiskeys and cigars. He could show them the truth, that he wasn't some stray dog, not some failed worker they could laugh about. He was a graduate with honors, a strategist, a man who had chosen humility out of necessity, not ignorance. But then his thoughts shifted. He thought of Zoe, of Baron, of the way the girl held her coat closed with both hands to keep out the cold, of the way the boy tried to smile to make her feel safe. He imagined them waiting behind the building, their little feet stamping the pavement for warmth, wondering if he was late because something had gone wrong. That was enough. He inhaled deeply. The cold stung on the way in. Then he adjusted the bag on his shoulder and walked on without a word, without a glance back. Behind him, the laughter rose again, louder, now emboldened by what they believed was silence, born of submission. They couldn't have been more wrong. That night, after the children had eaten, huddled on a blanket in the corner of his small kitchen cheeks, pink from the hot food and warmth, Timothy tucked them in and sat in the far corner of the apartment. The light overhead flickered faintly, casting a warm glow over the chipped paint of the walls. His mother, already asleep in her bed behind a thin curtain, murmured softly in her sleep. Outside, the wind howled against the windowpane. Timothy reached into the drawer beside the couch and pulled out an old notebook, its corners bent and its cover faded. It wasn't a journal or a diary. It was something else, something he hadn't touched in a while, not since the early days at the Gilded Spoon. He turned the pages slowly past a few old notes and grocery lists until he found the first blank page. Then he began writing. He recorded Stephen's words that night verbatim. He wrote down the names of the men who laughed beside him. He described the setting, the time, the tone of voice, the insults. Then, one by one, he began listing other things, conversations he had overheard months earlier while working at the Gilded Spoon. Details came back with surprising clarity. Comments whispered over wine between businessmen who thought a black waiter didn't matter. Transactions discussed in half code between vendors and managers. Mentions of inflated invoices, under-the-table labor arrangements, and questionable tax filings. For months, Timothy had stood beside linen-draped tables, refilling water glasses and serving lamb chops, listening quietly. People spoke freely around him, not realizing or not caring that he had a mind trained in business, that he could remember figures, numbers, and names like snapshots. That night, all of it began to come together. As the pages filled, he felt something unfamiliar control. Not over the world, not yet, but over the truth. He could hold it, document it, build with it. "You'll find out," he murmured under his breath, his voice low and even. "You underestimated the wrong person." He closed the notebook and placed it beside him on the couch. For a moment, he just sat there staring at the wall across from him, hands resting on his knees. There was no triumph in his expression, no fire, no fury, just a quiet, deep resolve. They thought he was invisible, but he was writing the story now. 3 weeks after that bitter night outside the private club, the children were simply gone. No warning, no note, no goodbye. Timothy came home with a grocery bag containing a few apples and cans of soup, meager, but enough to get them through another night, and found the small mattress in the corner of the room empty. Their blankets were still there, hastily folded. A pair of tiny shoes sat neatly beside the wall. But Baron and Zoe were nowhere to be found. At first, he thought they might have gone outside to get some air, maybe wandered off to the corner store or the park. He paced the block 3 times. He checked alleyways, knocked on neighbors' doors, asked anyone he knew who might have seen 2 white children, one thin boy with dark blonde hair, always protective, and a pale-skinned girl with big, guarded eyes. No one had seen them. The evening turned into night, night into morning. Timothy didn't sleep. He sat by the window, arms resting on the sill, eyes searching the dark for any sign of movement. The city's noises felt louder somehow, the distant hum of cars, the rustle of leaves, the buzz of a flickering street lamp outside his building, but no small footsteps, no voices. The following day, he began making calls, first to the police, then to social services, and finally to every shelter and foster office he could find. Most lines placed him on hold. Others transferred him repeatedly. Finally, after nearly 2 days of persistence, someone told him what had happened. Baron and Zoe had been picked up by Child Protective Services. A neighbor had reported 2 children living with a man who wasn't their guardian, and the authorities had intervened. They had been placed in a state-run institution, not in the city, not even in the same state. They had been relocated, Timothy was told, for their own safety. He asked for the address. They refused. He asked to visit. "You're not family," they replied. He offered to file paperwork to explain the circumstances. The voice on the other end of the line stayed neutral but firm. "That won't change anything." The call ended with a quiet click. Timothy sat still for a long time afterward. The light outside had faded. Inside the apartment, the silence pressed against his chest. His hands rested on the table, palms flat. His mind swam. Not with panic, he was long past that, but with something colder. He felt stripped bare. It wasn't just loss. It was a kind of theft. He had been punished for helping. And the children had been taken as if they were objects without voice or history, as if their connection to him had never existed. It was the final straw, not because it broke him, but because it crystallized something inside him, something that had been building quietly with every insult, every slammed door, every job he was denied, every laugh he had endured. It wasn't breaking him anymore. It was forging something else. That night after his mother fell asleep, he reopened the notebook. Not with the same tentative hand as before, but with focused, steady movement. He flipped through the pages, studying the names, dates, and figures he had recorded. He began to draw lines between entries. He started building a structure, mapping out patterns. What Stephen Garrick and the men at that club never imagined was that beneath Timothy's quiet exterior was not a man content with survival, but a strategist. One with a business degree, a sharp memory, and now something far more dangerous than anger, purpose. Over the next 2 years, while Stephen toasted his so-called victory over the problem waiter, Timothy was working 16-hour days. He washed floors, cleaned office buildings, restocked shelves in the dead of night. Every dollar he earned went toward rent utilities and his mother's care. Every spare moment went into building something that no one could see. The notebook became a ledger, then a database, then a full set of spreadsheets. He borrowed time at library computers, studied financial compliance manuals, learned basic forensic accounting techniques. He pieced together every stray remark, every carelessly discarded receipt, every drunken story he'd overheard while waiting tables. He began to see patterns, real damning patterns. It wasn't just arrogance. These men were engaged in systemic fraud. Stephen Garrick and his circle men, who had humiliated him, who laughed as they stepped over the poor, had been inflating contracts for decades. They funneled payments through shell vendors, employed workers off the books to avoid taxes, and manipulated expense reports to claim deductions on things that never existed. Timothy had names. He had documents. He had timelines. He had amounts. It was a body of evidence so detailed, so methodical, that even he began to feel the weight of what he was assembling. He kept everything hidden in folders, flash drives, printouts buried under the mattress, not because he was afraid, but because the time wasn't right. Not yet. He knew better than to strike while still wounded. They had thought they were mocking a man who had nothing. But what they had done without realizing it was give him everything he needed, not just motive, blueprint. And he was building it quietly, carefully, without fanfare, just like they had taught him to do when they thought he was invisible. It was raining the day Caroline Christopher passed away. Not a dramatic sweeping storm, just a steady gray curtain of water that blurred the hospital windows and soaked the sidewalks outside. The kind of rain that made everything feel slower, heavier. Inside the public hospital, fluorescent lights hummed quietly overhead. The walls were painted a pale beige, chipped in places, and the waiting room chairs had long since lost their padding. Timothy sat beside her bed, one hand gently wrapped around hers. Her skin was thinner than he remembered, cool to the touch. Her breathing had grown shallow in recent hours, her voice faint, fading. They had been waiting for treatment for nearly 6 hours. The staff did what they could, but this wasn't the kind of place where people got better. It was the kind of place where people were told to wait quietly until there was nothing left to wait for. Caroline turned her head toward him slowly, her eyes clouded, but still focused on his face. There was a trace of a smile, sad, but full of love. Her fingers tightened slightly around his. Then she whispered, barely audible, "Don't let the anger consume you, boy. Use this pain to build something greater." Her voice cracked on the last word, her breath uneven. Timothy leaned in closer, holding her hand to his chest. He wanted to respond, but his throat tightened. He could only nod, eyes stinging. In that moment, there in a room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and sorrow, he made her a promise that he wouldn't waste the pain, that he wouldn't be broken by it. He would build. When she passed, it was quiet. No machines beeped, no alarm sounded, just a long, slow exhale, and then nothing. The funeral took place the following week, a modest gathering under overcast skies. The service was held at a small chapel on the east side of the city, attended mostly by neighbors, a few distant relatives, and one man Timothy didn't immediately recognize. He stood near the back, well-dressed but not ostentatious. His black coat was sharply tailored, but his demeanor was humble, watchful, respectful. After the service ended and mourners slowly filed out into the drizzle, the man approached Timothy at the edge of the cemetery. "You must be Timothy," he said, gently extending a hand. "I'm Daniel Bai. I knew your mother from college. We were in the same economics seminar. She always had the sharpest questions in the room." Timothy nodded slowly, gripping the man's hand with tired fingers. "She spoke of you often," Bai continued. "She said you had the mind for something great, but the world kept trying to convince you that you didn't." There was no pity in his tone, only recognition. The kind of recognition that comes from someone who's walked a similar road. Doctor Bai, the son of Chinese immigrants, had known his share of closed doors and subtle insults. He knew what it meant to be overlooked, not for lack of merit, but because of how others saw your name, your face, your skin. Timothy didn't say much, but something about Bai's presence measured genuine, invited trust. After a moment's hesitation, he pulled a folder from his coat pocket, worn at the edges, packed with handwritten notes and carefully typed pages. It was the culmination of years of quiet labor, evidence, patterns, names, numbers. "I want to show you something," Timothy said, handing over the file. Bai took it carefully, then stepped beneath a tree for shelter. He began to read. The minutes passed in near silence. The wind rustled the wet branches above them. Cars rolled slowly past the cemetery gates, their tires hissing on the wet pavement. As Bai flipped through the pages, his eyebrows lifted just slightly. A page turned, then another. By the 10th or 11th page, his expression had shifted from polite interest to concentrated intensity. He read the same paragraph twice, then leaned in, squinting at a handwritten annotation in the margin. "This," he murmured, "this is a tax bomb." He said it more to himself than to Timothy. "If even half of this is accurate." "It's all accurate," Timothy said calmly. His voice wasn't defensive. It was steady quiet. "I was there when they said it, when they thought I wasn't listening. They thought I was furniture." Dr. Bai looked up from the folder, eyes sharp with new understanding. There was no need to ask further. He closed the file, held it against his chest, and exhaled. "You have two options," he said at last. "You can turn this over to the IRS and hope they take it seriously. Maybe they'll open an investigation. Maybe not." He paused. "Or we build a case ourselves, one so airtight, so thoroughly documented, they'll have no choice but to act." Timothy nodded once slowly. The decision had already been made in his heart. He hadn't come this far just to hand it over and hope. He was going to finish what he had started. Together they would begin to do just that. While Timothy quietly built his case, Stephen Garrick's world was growing in wealth, reach, and arrogance. Over the course of several months, Stephen acquired two competing restaurants in the downtown area, folding them into his portfolio without hesitation. He operated by the same formula that had always benefited him: white employees at the front of the house, and in management minimum wage workers in the back, most of them minorities, all of them replaceable. On paper, the new businesses looked legitimate. In reality, many of the employment contracts were barely contracts at all, unsigned, undated, and in some cases, completely fabricated. Stephen's empire was expanding not just because of his business acumen, but because no one ever questioned him. Not the local officials who dined in his private booths, nor the investors who appreciated his charm and performance. With each deal closed, his sense of superiority swelled. At a business lunch one afternoon, wine glasses gleaming, laughter echoing in a downtown bistro, he leaned across the table toward a fellow executive and chuckled. "Did you see that?" he said, gesturing casually with his fork. "That waiter I fired a few years ago, the one who stole food. He's a janitor now." He paused, savoring the moment, then delivered the punchline with a smug grin. "Karma works. People like that. They need to know their place in the world." The others laughed lightly in the polite way people do when they don't want to appear complicit, but also don't dare push back. No one questioned whether the story was true. In Stephen's circles, assumptions were as good as facts, especially when they confirmed long-held prejudices. What Stephen didn't know, what never even crossed his mind, was that the janitor he so confidently dismissed was now cleaning the very building where his accounting firm kept its records. 3 nights a week, Timothy pushed a cart of cleaning supplies down quiet hallways and emptied trash cans in dimly lit offices. Most people ignored him. A few nodded. None suspected that this man in gray overalls, gloves tucked into his waistband had spent years studying financial systems and now held a silent vendetta that was precise, calculated, and fully awake. He didn't just sweep floors. He photographed documents carelessly left on desks: bank statements, expense reports, internal memos. He memorized passwords scribbled on sticky notes. He copied entire spreadsheets onto encrypted drives. He made recordings too, voices carrying through thin plaster walls, late-night phone calls filled with bravado and carelessness. All of it carefully cataloged. At Dr. Bai's small office, the evidence piled up. The walls were lined with shelves filled with color-coded binders. Timothy would arrive after shifts with folders tucked under his coat, and Bai would scan each page with increasing admiration. "You should have been a detective," Bai said one evening, flipping through a set of altered tax filings and matching them to employee rosters that didn't exist. "This is professional-level investigative work." Timothy allowed a small smile to form at the corner of his mouth. "I had good teachers," he said, glancing down at the papers. "I just never imagined I'd be using that knowledge like this." He paused. The difference now is this time, it's personal. They worked late into the night, often with just the hum of a desk lamp and the rustle of paper between them. Bai brought structure and legal insight. Timothy brought memory observation and relentless precision. Together they built a case that was airtight, undeniable, and deeply incriminating. Then came the turning point. One evening, while organizing surveillance files, Timothy discovered a new folder on the office server plans for a nationwide restaurant chain under Stephen's name. It wasn't a pipe dream. The documents were polished, professional, filled with projections and legal forms. The venture was being quietly prepared, financed by a consortium of international investors and supported by a public relations team, ready to launch a media campaign about ethical business practices. Timothy stared at the documents for a long time, his jaw clenched. The project was bold, but it hinged entirely on one thing: Stephen's public image. If that image cracked, the entire deal would collapse. Dr. Bai reviewed the files later that week, his fingers tapping nervously on the desk as he read. "This is it," he said finally. "It's now or never. If we let him seal these contracts and lock in those international partners, he'll be wrapped in legal armor, untouchable. We'd never get close again. Timothy stood near the window, watching the late afternoon light bounce off the city buildings. People rushed home with briefcases and umbrellas. Cars crawled through intersections. Everything looked ordinary. But in that moment, Timothy didn't feel ordinary. He no longer felt like the man who had once been fired in front of a full kitchen. He no longer felt like the invisible janitor sweeping the corners of corporate offices. He felt like a strategist, the strategist he had always been, but now, with cause. "He thinks he destroyed me," Timothy said, still looking out the window. His voice was calm, but something burned behind it. "He doesn't realize he gave me time. Time to prepare properly." Dr. Bai turned to him, eyes meeting his with a shared recognition. He had seen that fire before in courtrooms in quiet battles no one else noticed. The fire of someone who had waited patiently, worked silently, and was now ready to strike, not with vengeance, but with precision. Then it's time to show him who really knows how to play this game. They didn't rush. They didn't announce anything. They planned carefully, deliberately. The folders were labeled, the timeline set, the evidence cross-referenced and backed up on multiple encrypted drives. Key agencies were identified, whistleblower protections were reviewed, press contacts were outlined. Each move was weighed and timed. Timothy took a breath one night as they finalized the timeline. He closed a binder and looked across the table at Bai. He thought of his mother, then of her last words, of the promise he made in that hospital room with the flickering fluorescent light and the cold metal chair. He remembered how her hand felt in his, how she asked him not to let anger swallow him whole, but to build something from it. And that was exactly what he was doing. Stephen Garrick had grossly underestimated the power of a man with no resources, no protection, no institutional support, but with discipline, education, and nothing left to lose. A man who had been humiliated, ignored, discarded, yet never broken. Everyone had seen a janitor. No one had seen what he truly was, a strategist gathering ammunition for a war that had already begun, one Stephen didn't even know he was losing. It was a Tuesday morning in March when the first visible crack appeared in the armor of Stephen Garrick's carefully constructed empire. The sky was clear, the kind of crisp spring morning that made the glass towers of the financial district gleam in the sun. Stephen sat in his office on the 20th floor, a modern corner suite with polished wood trim and expansive views of the city. The desk was sleek, organized with precision. His Italian tie was knotted perfectly. A cup of espresso steamed on a silver tray beside him. He leaned back in his leather chair, reviewing architectural renderings for his upcoming restaurant chain expansion. The projections looked strong. The branding was bold. The future, as far as he could see, was clean, profitable, and under his control. That illusion shattered with the ring of his desk phone. "Garrick," he answered, not looking up from the paper in his hand. On the other end, his chief accountant, Peterson, was already in mid-sentence. His voice was high and tight, unmistakably laced with panic. "Mr. Garrick, there's an IRS audit team here, right now. They've walked into the office with badges and a full list of demands. They're asking for financial documents from the last 5 years. Stephen let out a short, dismissive laugh. He adjusted his cufflinks and turned toward the window, still composed. "Routine," he said coolly. "We're a solid company. Give them the books." There was a long pause. Sir Peterson said, his voice cracking, "They're not asking for the official books. They brought documents, copies of spreadsheets I've never seen before, payment logs, vendor lists, internal memos. Stuff that, sir, they have things that shouldn't exist." Stephen's face stiffened. "What do you mean, shouldn't exist?" "They know about the ghost employees, the inflated vendor contracts, and the Cayman Islands account, the one you told us no one else even knew about. They have account numbers, transaction logs, everything." The words hung in the air like a lead weight. Stephen's grip tightened on the phone. He stood slowly, suddenly aware of how loud the city seemed beyond the window car horns, a construction drill voices echoing off the pavement 20 stories below. He tried to speak, but nothing came. His composure cracked for the first time in years. Across town, in a far smaller, far humbler apartment, Timothy Christopher sat on a second-hand couch, a worn coffee mug resting between his palms. The TV was on, playing the morning news with low volume. The room was quiet, filled with the soft hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of a wall clock. Then his phone rang. He picked it up with a calm hand. Dr. Bai's voice came through the line, steady, but carrying the weight of something long awaited. "It started," he said simply. Timothy closed his eyes just for a second. His thumb traced the rim of the coffee cup. He saw his mother in his mind, her worn hands, her tired but patient smile, her voice urging him to build something from the pain. She would be proud, he said softly. Dr. Bai didn't disagree. And that's only the beginning, he added. The Department of Justice has been alerted, and we made sure the health department received the working conditions file. Every kitchen, every payroll discrepancy, every falsified inspection. Timothy nodded silently, his chest rising with the kind of breath that comes not from relief, but from the shift of long-held weight. 2 days later, the second blow landed. Stephen Garrick, freshly shaken but still clinging to the illusion of control, was seated in a glass conference room high above the downtown skyline. The room was full of dark suits, polished accents, and power lunches. Around the table sat the key players, representatives of an international investment group, most of them European, and all of them crucial to the financing of his restaurant chain's next phase. The presentation had begun smoothly. Charts, numbers, projected earnings, everything meticulously prepared. Then the door burst open. Stephen's assistant entered without knocking her face pale, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a printed note. "Mr. Garrick," she said quickly, her voice low but urgent, "there are reporters in the lobby from the local paper and 2 regional networks. They're asking about tax evasion and labor abuse." Stephen's face froze. She continued, "They're saying there's a full exposé publishing tomorrow, with documents, interviews, audio recordings. Herr Schmidt, the lead investor, a sharp-eyed man in his 60s, with a reputation for zero tolerance, leaned forward slowly. "What is this, Garrick?" he asked, his accent crisp and unforgiving. "Our firm does not associate with questionable operations." Stephen wiped a bead of sweat from the back of his neck. "It's nothing. A misunderstanding. A disgruntled former employee, maybe. You know how these things go." But Herr Schmidt wasn't listening. He was already exchanging glances with his advisors, silently calculating risk. The next morning, the newspaper hit stands across the city. The headline took up nearly half the front page. "Food Empire Built on Exploitation and Tax Evasion, the Truth Behind Garrick's Restaurants." The article was devastating. It laid everything bare: systematic underpayment of black employees, some earning half of what their white counterparts made for identical work, hazardous conditions in kitchens, unsafe housing offered to migrant staff, a sophisticated network of shell companies, and fraudulent deductions. None of it speculation, every claim was backed by evidence. Dozens of spreadsheets, dozens of names. But what ignited the most public outrage was an audio recording leaked anonymously, where Stephen Garrick could be heard clearly laughing as he said, "Black people have to know their place. I pay the minimum wage because that's all they deserve." There was no mistaking the voice. The clip aired on radio, then television, then online. Stephen's phone began ringing before sunrise. First his legal team, then the PR firm, then the board, then the investors. Panicked, furious. He called the newspaper himself just before noon. His voice trembled, not with sadness or regret, but rage. "This is a setup," he barked. "This is targeted. This is persecution." The reporter on the other end was calm, steady. "Mr. Garrick," she said, "we have dozens of hours of recordings, over 400 documents, testimony from 42 former employees. Would you like to comment officially?" Stephen didn't answer right away. For the first time, there was no speech prepared, no charm to deploy, just silence and the distant sound of the walls finally beginning to collapse. The third and final rupture was not just a crack in Stephen Garrick's empire, it was a total collapse. It began with the swift, cold precision of the investors' withdrawal. Within hours of the exposé hitting the newsstands, the International Finance Group released a public statement. All pending contracts with Garrick Holdings were canceled, effective immediately. No press conference, no negotiation, just one clean surgical cut. Next came the banks. Garrick's accounts, once flowing with millions, were suddenly frozen flagged for federal investigation. His CFO called in a panic, unable to move payroll. Credit lines were locked, vendor payments bounced. By noon the next day, 3 of Stephen's restaurants had their operating licenses suspended by the health department for violations previously buried, now impossible to ignore. And then came the avalanche of lawsuits. Dozens of employees, most of them people of color, began filing formal complaints. Harassment, wage theft, unsafe conditions. Stories poured out in online forums and social media. A former dishwasher described being ridiculed for speaking Spanish. A line cook recounted being denied breaks during double shifts. Hostesses shared stories of being told to hide in the back during important clientele visits. The silence that had protected Garrick's empire for years shattered into a storm of voices, each one more damning than the last. By Friday morning, the conference room at Garrick Holdings, once the site of high-powered deals and champagne toasts, felt more like an interrogation chamber. Stephen sat at the head of the long table flanked by his legal team. They were younger than him, most of them impeccably dressed and visibly concerned. Laptops glowed, phones buzzed, the air was thick with tension. Stephen tried to speak, but couldn't finish a full sentence. Every plan he'd made, every deal, every exit strategy was now unraveling in real time. Then his phone rang. He glanced at the screen confused. It was a blocked number. He answered quickly, half hoping it was a PR firm calling with damage control strategy. "Hello, who is this?" He demanded, voice sharp and defensive. There was a pause. Then came a voice, calm, clear, with a politeness that carried a hint of something Stephen couldn't place right away. Not aggression, not gloating. Something colder, more precise. "Hi, boss." Stephen stiffened. "Who is this?" he repeated, though his stomach already tightened. The voice answered smoothly. "Timothy Christopher. Remember me, the waiter you fired 3 years ago for feeding orphan children." Silence fell across the room. Stephen's lawyers looked at him puzzled, his face already pale, drained of all remaining color. His mouth opened, but no words came. When he finally spoke, it was almost a whisper. How did you get all this information?" Across town, sunlight streamed through a modest window into a small office, clean, quiet, simple. Timothy sat behind a wooden desk, a single plant on the windowsill, a stack of organized folders in the corner. He smiled faintly, watching the breeze stir the blinds. "Did you really believe," he said softly, "that a man with a business degree and straight A's would just sit still after being humiliated in front of a room full of people?" Stephen stammered, panic creeping into his voice. "That's impossible." "You were a janitor, I was," Timothy replied evenly. "For 3 years. I cleaned floors. I emptied your trash. I vacuumed the offices of your accountants. Do you have any idea how many private conversations are carried out behind thin walls? How many sensitive documents get left behind on open desks when people think the invisible are watching?" Stephen stood abruptly, waving for his lawyers to leave the room. They hesitated, sensing something pivotal was unfolding, but eventually complied. "You recorded private conversations," he barked. "That's illegal." Timothy's tone didn't waver. "Crime," he said, "slowly is evading millions in taxes. Crime is creating fake employees to funnel money through shell companies. Crime is paying black workers half what you pay white workers for the same job. Crime is humiliation disguised as leadership. I didn't commit a crime. I just documented the truth." Stephen collapsed into the chair behind him. His hand trembled as he clutched the phone. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Money, is that what this is about? I can pay. Name the amount." Timothy chuckled quietly, but there was no cruelty in it, only clarity. "Mr. Garrick," he said, "you still don't get it. I don't want anything from you, because I already have everything I need." "What does that mean?" Stephen demanded, his tone rising into disbelief. "It means," Timothy said, his voice calm as ever, "that the Cayman Islands account you thought was off the grid. The IRS has the full statement history. It means the inflated contracts with your shell vendors. The district attorney has them now. And the recordings where you speak about teaching black people their place. Those have been distributed to every major news outlet in the region. Television, radio, online." There was a moment of silence. Then Stephen's voice broke. That will ruin me." "No, Mr. Garrick," Timothy replied, the finality in his voice unmistakable. "You ruined yourself. I just kept the receipts." At that very moment, the tension in the conference room cracked wide open as Stephen Garrick's assistant burst through the door, clearly shaken. Her eyes were wide, her voice breathless, and her clipboard clutched tightly in both hands, as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. "Mr. Garrick," she said, urgently, glancing nervously at the lawyers in the room, "your employees are walking out. All of them. The floor managers, the chefs, even the junior staff. They're quitting en masse. And that's not all. The union is here. They're in the lobby. And—" She hesitated, clearly unsure how to soften the blow. "There's a news crew downstairs. They're demanding a statement. They said if you decline, they'll broadcast without your input. They already have the recordings." Stephen's hand shot up instinctively, covering the receiver of the phone. His voice was strained, tight with panic. "Tell them I'm not here," he hissed. "I'm unavailable, make something up." The assistant hesitated, her gaze locked on Stephen's trembling hand. "They said," she repeated cautiously, "that they already have enough footage and documentation to run the story without your side. But they're giving you a final opportunity to respond. That's all." Stephen didn't reply. His jaw clenched, his mind raced. Around him, the sterile conference room suddenly felt unbearably hot. The fluorescent lights too harsh, the air too thin. His carefully crafted empire was crumbling, not slowly, but all at once. On the other end of the phone line, Timothy's calm voice returned, cutting through the rising noise like a scalpel. There was no anger in his tone, only an unwavering stillness, like someone who had already made peace with what needed to be done. "Mr. Garrick," he said, "are you still there?" Stephen hesitated. His voice, when it came, was barely audible. "Why are you doing this to me?" he asked, his tone no longer that of a powerful businessman, but of a man unmoored, shaken, and lost. Timothy didn't raise his voice. He didn't gloat. He simply spoke the truth. "Because you made a choice," he replied, steady and firm. "3 years ago, you saw a man trying to feed 2 hungry, homeless children, and instead of helping, you chose to humiliate him. You fired me in front of an entire staff just to prove a point. And then, as if that weren't enough, you spread lies to make sure I'd never work in this town again. You crushed my reputation to protect your ego. You didn't just ruin a job, you tried to ruin a life. That was your choice." In the office, Stephen stood frozen. The city outside looked different now. Gray and distant. He could see a small crowd forming on the sidewalk below, gathering in front of the building. Cameras were visible, microphones raised. He couldn't read the signs from this height, but he didn't need to. He could guess what they said. He felt a knot forming in his throat. I was just a businessman," he mumbled, "trying to protect what I built." There was a pause on the line. "And I was just a son," Timothy replied, "trying to take care of his sick mother." The contrast between them hung heavily in the silence that followed. "The difference, Mr. Garrick," Timothy added softly, "is that I never had to step on other people to do it." That line landed like a final gavel. It wasn't vengeance, it was judgment. It was truth spoken plainly without flourish, and it left no room for rebuttal. The call ended. The office grew eerily quiet. Outside the glass walls, Stephen could hear the faint murmur of the crowd, building news vans, pulling up doors, slamming voices rising. But inside, the only sound was the mechanical hum of the air conditioning and the slow creak of his leather chair as he sat down alone. That afternoon, one by one, the last of Garrick Holdings' employees exited the building, some carrying boxes of personal belongings, others walking empty-handed, but with a sense of closure. No one spoke to Stephen. No one made eye contact. The hallway that had once echoed with greetings, instructions, and the quiet rhythm of a functioning business now stood silent. His secretary had resigned by email that morning, short and clinical. The accountant had not shown up to work at all and had not answered his phone. Even the building's doorman, who had once smiled and opened the door for Stephen without fail, now greeted him with a brief, cold nod and looked away. Stephen stood in the middle of his office, once the symbol of his success, now stripped of energy and meaning. The walls, covered in framed certificates and stock photos of teamwork, seemed hollow. The once pristine desk was littered with unanswered messages and unopened legal notices. He sank into the chair behind it. His shoulders slumped, his tie loosened. For the first time in his career, Stephen Garrick had no meeting to attend, no assistant to schedule his day, no deal to close. There was only silence, and the realization that everything he had built on intimidation, exploitation, and lies had fallen not by force, but by truth. And the man who had spoken that truth, he was not the janitor Stephen had dismissed. He was the strategist Stephen had never seen coming. Across town, in a quiet sunlit office lined with neatly stacked files and a small potted fern in the corner, Timothy's phone rang. He had been going over numbers from a recent audit, sipping from a mug that read, "Justice is a process." He picked up, already knowing who it would be. Dr. Bai's voice came through the line, brisk and tinged with satisfaction. "The German investors want to speak with you," he said. "They've seen the reports and the documentation. They're impressed, Timothy. Apparently they're searching for someone with your skills for a permanent role in internal auditing. High-level work. No janitor uniforms required." Timothy leaned back in his chair, a slow, quiet smile forming. For a moment he said nothing. His mind drifted just briefly to the small, overworked public hospital room, where his mother had once whispered through dry, chapped lips, use this pain to build something greater, and he had. On television that evening, the fall of Stephen Garrick's once vaunted business empire dominated every channel. The camera panned across shuttered restaurant windows overgrown with vines and slapped with health department notices. Former employees appeared one after another, their faces a mix of grief, relief, and quiet triumph. They spoke of years of humiliation, of being passed over, for promotions, of whispering among themselves in stockrooms about wages that didn't add up. Their voices cracked but never wavered. Financial experts explained to viewers how the millions of dollars Garrick had hidden from taxes could have funded public clinics, community programs, even school lunches. This wasn't just corporate greed, one commentator said. This was an attack on the most vulnerable corners of our society. And then came the speculation. Who was the whistleblower? The anchor asked, her brow furrowed as she looked into the camera. Who had access to this level of detail? Who risked everything to bring the truth into the light? They didn't have the answer. But across town, in a now vacant luxury apartment stripped of its artwork and designer furniture, Stephen Garrick did. He sat alone on a worn-out couch watching the broadcast with the blank stare of a man who had lost everything. Just that morning, the bank had repossessed his mansion. His cars already sold his savings, drained by legal fees. On the screen, the news showed a still image of one of his grand openings from years ago, him in a navy suit, grinning beneath a giant golden ribbon, then a cut to a legal document detailing over a dozen labor violations. He turned off the television with a jolt. It was no longer just about financial ruin. His name had become shorthand for the very injustice he had once felt entitled to ignore. He had dismissed Timothy Christopher like a bug, he once bragged, and now that same man had quietly orchestrated the dismantling of everything Stephen had built. As Stephen sat there, the silence of his empty apartment settling around him like dust, one question surfaced, clear and unrelenting. Could an empire built on entitlement and cruelty ever expect to last? And when it finally collapsed, who was truly destroyed? 6 months later, on the top floor of a sleek glass tower in the city's financial district, Timothy Christopher opened the door to his new office. This was not the modest, rented space he and Dr. Bai had once shared above a copy shop. This was a penthouse suite, furnished not with arrogance, but with quiet confidence. Polished wood, open light, and a large whiteboard filled with names and timelines ready for their next case. Their firm had grown fast. What began as two men working nights and weekends had evolved into one of the most respected auditing teams in the region, their focus exposing discriminatory labor practices and corporate fraud. The Garrick case had gone viral, studied in law schools and business ethics courses. It wasn't just a story of downfall, it was a roadmap for resistance. Universities invited Timothy to speak. His lectures always followed the same rhythm. He never sensationalized, never made himself the hero. He simply told the truth. The best revenge, he'd say to rows of attentive students, is not destroying your enemy. It's building something he could never even imagine. And that was exactly what he had done. Meanwhile, far from the city lights and high-rises, Stephen Garrick now worked as a night manager at a gas station just off a forgotten highway. It wasn't the work that pained him, though standing for hours, restocking shelves and logging shifts at 2 a.m. was a far cry from executive boardrooms. It was the absence, the silence where power used to be, the invisibility. Every so often, a former club associate would pass through. They never said hello. Some didn't even make eye contact. Others looked at him with thinly veiled contempt, not for what he had done, but for being caught. He lived in a rented one-bedroom apartment over a garage. No car, no stocks, no club membership. His mailbox overflowed with past due notices and legal updates about the lawsuits still crawling through the courts. His name had become a cautionary tale. He was no longer discussed in the present tense. Bitterness hung on him like an old coat. Not rage, not even shame, just the slow, dull ache of realization that he had underestimated the wrong man, that the very qualities he once mocked Timothy's quietness, his patience, his refusal to fight dirty, were the weapons that undid him. For months, the news had been relentless, multi-million-dollar settlements, class action suits, federal investigations, a congressional inquiry. Stephen's face had appeared in every headline as the embodiment of a corrupt system unraveling. But Timothy's face, that remained mostly out of view by choice, because this was never about fame. It was about justice. And in the final measure, that's exactly what was delivered. It was a clear, sun-washed Thursday morning when the familiar sound of helicopter blades cut through the city air. The rhythmic whoop-whoop echoed above the rooftops, growing louder as it neared. In his top-floor office, where the morning light spilled across shelves lined with case files and framed photos of past victories, Timothy Christopher paused over a contract he was reviewing. He glanced up briefly, his pen still in hand, as his assistant entered with uncharacteristic urgency. "Mr. Christopher," she said, nearly breathless eyes alight with something between disbelief and awe. "There's a helicopter landing on the helipad. 2 people are asking to speak with you. They say you'll know who they are." Timothy rose slowly. He didn't ask their names. He didn't need to. Somewhere deep inside, beyond the layers of pain, progress, and 20 years of relentless work, he had always known this day would come. When the elevator doors opened with a soft chime, the sunlight from the helipad framed 2 familiar silhouettes. Though decades had reshaped their faces, aged their features, and added the polish of professional life, he knew them instantly. Barron, tall and poised in a tailored gray suit, had the quiet confidence of a man who had learned leadership through hardship. His complexion was pale, his hair neatly combed, his handshake firm. Zoe stood beside him, blonde, bright-eyed, wearing a crisp navy blazer over her simple white blouse. There was something steady in her gaze, the kind of calm that comes only from purpose, deeply rooted. Timothy Barron said, his voice warm, but slightly unsteady with emotion. "We knew we'd meet again someday." Timothy looked at them, stunned but smiling. His voice caught slightly as he replied, "You've grown up, and you've become exactly who I always believed you would be." They embraced first Barron, then Zoe, clasping his shoulders in a way that said everything words couldn't. The quiet hum of the city outside seemed to fade, replaced by something sacred in the stillness of that moment. Zoe gently opened the leather folder she was carrying and placed a stack of carefully arranged papers on the table. Yellowed newspaper clippings, printed news articles, official court reports, all about the Garrick case. We followed everything she explained, her voice composed but full of feeling. "When your name appeared in the news, we knew exactly who you were. The man who fed us when we had no one became the man who brought down an empire built on cruelty and prejudice." Barron added with quiet conviction, "It wasn't a coincidence. It never was." For the next few hours, they sat together, the city buzzing far below them, untouched by the conversation unfolding in that glass-walled office. Barron shared how his restaurant chain had grown over the years, but how he had deliberately kept it rooted in the values Timothy had unknowingly instilled in him: dignity, inclusion, and the moral obligation to uplift the vulnerable. His restaurants prioritized hiring people who had been overlooked: former foster youth, single parents, refugees, people rebuilding after incarceration. "You taught me that it wasn't just about feeding people," Barron said, his voice thick with emotion. "It was about feeding them with respect." Zoe, too, had carved out a life that traced its origin back to Timothy's quiet courage. As a civil rights attorney, she had taken on some of the most complex and high-profile cases in the country: systemic housing discrimination, unlawful police practices, institutional bias in education. But she spoke now, not of victories or courtrooms, but of a single night long ago. "You showed us that kindness doesn't mean weakness," she said, "and that smart strategy can be an act of love." Then, almost shyly, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small, well-worn piece of paper, its edges frayed, the colors faded with time. She unfolded it slowly, as if unveiling something sacred. It was the same drawing they had given Timothy so long ago, a figure in the middle of a storm, arms outstretched, shielding 2 children from the rain. "We've kept it," she said softly. "All these years. It traveled with us to every foster home, every dorm room, every apartment. We had it framed eventually." Timothy took the paper in his hands, eyes misting. He traced the lines gently with his finger, as though revisiting the memory through touch alone. "You know," he said after a long pause, his voice low and steady, "I did all of that for you too. Every spreadsheet I studied, every document I copied, every hour I worked through the night. I was thinking of kids like you. I wanted to make sure no one would ever have to go through what you did." Zoe nodded, blinking quickly. Then she slid a second folder across the table. "Actually, we came here with a proposal." Inside was a preliminary charter, professionally written and already reviewed by legal counsel. It was for a new foundation, one they wanted to co-found with Timothy. "We're calling it the Bridge Initiative," she explained. "Programs that identify at-risk children and connect them with mentors, opportunities, scholarships. But also, restaurants' vocational training centers, Barron interjected, modeled after what I've already built, places that teach people real skills, and not just for profit, but for dignity, for stability. Timothy leaned forward, listening as the two spoke not like children returning to thank a mentor, but as equals, as collaborators, as living proof that everything he had sacrificed had meant something. We already have investors, Zoe said, government support, a network of corporate partners who believe in this. But we need someone who understands that social justice isn't about slogans. It's about structure, action, strategy. Timothy closed the folder slowly and sat back, exhaling in silence. He looked at the two faces before him, white, successful kind, and felt a wave of something he hadn't felt in a long time, deep, undeniable peace. The circle had closed, the storm had passed, and now it was time to build something even greater. That afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, Timothy Christopher sat across from Barron and Zoe, reviewing the preliminary plans for what would soon be known as the Christopher Lynn Foundation. The room was modern, but understated with clean lines, warm wood finishes, and walls lined with framed certificates and childhood artwork donated by students the foundation had already supported. A subtle breeze whispered beyond the glass, the city humming below, with its endless rhythm cars weaving between lights, people darting in and out of buildings, lives unfolding in quiet defiance or silent struggle. Timothy stood and walked to the window, resting one hand on the cool glass. From 20 stories up, the city looked orderly, structured even, but he knew better. He saw beneath the surface the chaos many lived through daily, people chasing second chances, people rebuilding from broken systems, people still enduring what he once endured. That view, wide, sobering, alive, reminded him that every number in their reports, every policy they challenged, every child they mentored, was tied to a real human story. He knew Stephen Garrick was still somewhere in this very city, maybe watching the same sky from a much smaller place, still clutching his bruised pride, still wondering how everything had unraveled. Timothy imagined him pacing in circles, obsessing over how a man he once dismissed as just a waiter had quietly dismantled his empire piece by piece. But as Timothy stood there, hands relaxed at his sides, his chest rising with a quiet breath, there was no trace of anger left, only calm, only purpose, and above all, an unshakable satisfaction. Not from vengeance, but from knowing he had proven something far greater, that intellect, patience, and moral clarity could achieve what power and arrogance never could. 2 years later, the Christopher Lynn Foundation had grown into something remarkable, something powerful, and deeply needed. With centers now operating in major cities across the country, the foundation had helped more than 500 children receive life-changing scholarships and mentorship. Families, over 2,000 of them, had received legal support and advice that would have otherwise remained out of reach. And 8 vocational restaurant schools were now running, each one built on the simple idea that work should bring not just a paycheck, but dignity. The foundation's offices were busy every day. Lawyers drafting protections for migrant workers, educators reviewing new curriculum for students in underfunded schools, and former employees from places like Garrick's restaurants leading training sessions for the next generation. These weren't just programs, they were proof that justice could be implemented, scaled, and sustained. Timothy had become a fixture in national media, no longer a name associated with shame, but with vision. The public no longer saw the man who was fired for feeding children. They saw a leader, a reformer, a tactician. His once small auditing firm had evolved into the country's leading watchdog on labor ethics, an institution that struck fear into the hearts of executives who once scoffed at diversity, fairness, and compliance. On a quiet Thursday evening, Timothy appeared on a national talk show, seated across from a seasoned journalist known for her piercing interviews. The studio was softly lit, the atmosphere serious but warm. A live audience listened intently as the interviewer leaned forward, eyes focused. "Mr. Christopher," she said, "what would you say to people watching tonight? People going through what you went through? People who feel silenced, overlooked, or humiliated by systems they can't seem to fight?" Timothy adjusted his tie, a subtle gray silk piece that matched the deep charcoal suit he now wore with ease. He didn't rush the answer. Instead, he smiled gently, almost like a father addressing a younger version of himself. "The difference between revenge and justice is simple." He began, his voice steady, thoughtful. "Revenge destroys. Justice builds. There was a beat of silence in the room. He continued, "Stephen Garrick tried to destroy me, but in doing so, he unintentionally taught me how strong I could be. Not just to survive, but to rise to create something he never even imagined." The best revenge, Timothy added, glancing toward the camera, isn't in tearing your enemy down. It's in building something they could never stand among. He could almost hear his mother's voice then, Mrs. Caroline in that dim hospital room, her hand still warm in his, asking him to turn his pain into something greater. And he had. Every policy changed, every child helped, every restaurant graduate who stood tall after years of struggle. All of it was an answer to her last request. Stephen Garrick had tried to break him. Instead, he had forged him. And now, every single life transformed through the Christopher Lynn Foundation was another kind of justice, a living, breathing form of restitution. Every smiling graduate, every parent who could finally breathe easier, every child who looked toward their future with hope instead of fear, that was Timothy's answer to all the Garricks of the world. Because in the end, no matter how loud the insults, how cruel the dismissal, or how deep the humiliation, success, real success, speaks louder. And it always will. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this journey. If you felt something, anything, while listening to Timothy's story, that feeling matters. Because stories like his are not just about revenge or downfall. They're about resilience, about the quiet courage to do what's right when no one is watching. They remind us that kindness, when paired with clarity and strength, can ripple outward in ways we might never predict. Somewhere in this world, you took the time to watch, to listen, and perhaps to reflect. And for that, we're deeply grateful. We'd love to know where you're watching from, and more importantly, how this story made you feel. What part stayed with you? What part made you pause? If this story meant something to you, please consider giving it a like, subscribing, or sharing it with someone who believes in integrity, in second chances, or in the power of compassion to change lives. Your support helps these stories keep going. Until next time, stay kind, stay strong, and never forget the smallest act of dignity can shape a future you'll never see, but someone else will live. We'll see you in the next story.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.